Jobs empower individuals, reduce poverty, enhance well-being, and drive social stability and economic growth. Africa's largest and growing age group, its youth population, is also its least gainfully employed. Of Africa's over 400 million youth aged between 15 and 35, an estimated 2/3 are either unemployed or vulnerably employed. By 2050, Africa is expected to account for 1/4 of the world's working age population, making youth employment a critical issue not just for Africa, but for the rest of the world. As part of the Oxford Martin School's Future of Development program, this podcast series, Africa Which Way Employment, delves into strategies for creating decent jobs that elevate incomes and ensure economic progress across the continent. Hello and welcome to Africa Which Way Employment, a series dedicated to unpacking the multifaceted layers of unemployment of the continent, showcasing individuals and initiatives that are driving positive socioeconomic outcomes, and also inspiring actionable solutions to job creation and economic opportunity. My name is Oluwatamilore Oni, and today I am in Oxford and joined by Charlene Chen. Charlene leads Ezrah Charitable Trust, a private family foundation focused on economic and technology development across Africa. She has 20 years of private sector and social sector experience working with organizations ranging from tech startups and scale-ups to international nonprofits and Fortune 500 companies. For 8 years, she served as the Chief Operating Officer of socially impactful venture capital-backed businesses in the fintech and health tech industries, and co-founded a global community of COOs and operations professionals called Operations Nation. Charlene, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me, Tammy.
I'm looking forward to this conversation. I feel like we have so many things to unpack and talk about. In this episode, we'll be discussing what funders consider when investing within the employment space, how funding decisions are being made, and how funding can be more effective and efficient in helping to solve for unemployment. So first things first, we can start off with a little warm-up question. If you can share a fun job story or past job experience that, I guess, to make the skills training world more human, because we all experience this and we all have to kind of go through this skills or training or job search at some point.
Yeah.
Anything that you'd like to share?
I'll share a couple quick ones. So one was my first formal employment, which was as a waitress at the age of 18 in Charlotte, North Carolina, where I grew up. And I think I discovered my love for operations even there because, job training was just learning by experience. You watched what the other wait staff were doing, but I thought, well, where there was no onboarding, what if there was like a checklist? So I created essentially a standard operating procedure, a checklist of all the things that a wait person should know at that restaurant in Charlotte. And so now looking back on it, I realized
that was the beginning.
Yeah, that was the beginning of my love for operational excellence. And then more recently, this didn't result in a job, but it just taught me kind of the challenges of only getting halfway through your training. So for fun, I learned to fly a private planes, like a 4-seaters, when I lived in Nairobi, Kenya.
That's amazing.
And so you're supposed to do about 40 hours of flight time. I only did 20, which translates to I was really good at taking off, but really terrible at landing.
Okay.
So yeah, it's now a half-baked skill. So now I don't think any friend would dare fly with me.
Please complete it so that we can go on trips together. I would love to be like a passenger on one of your flights. But it's interesting. I think this question of completing trainings, but we can come back to that. But
Sure.
it's very telling of some of the experiences if you work within the employment. So getting people to start training for jobs and then also getting them to complete it is another question entirely.
Right.
But anyway, we'll get to that. But you've had such an incredible career that has spanned the private sector and social sector. Can you share a bit more about your journey into the youth employment space, and I guess also on the funding side. So what has sort of led you into the work that you're doing now at Ezrah Charitable Trust?
Sure. I won't go through my whole kind of CV or LinkedIn profile. But I think some of the things to highlight that I think have really shaped my sort of worldview and my perspective and philosophy now running the Family Foundation are shaped from being a doer. So there are some, but not all funders were actually doers, as we say in our sector. And I'm really grateful that, I started my career in IT consulting, which is a whole nother beast at Deloitte. But post-business school, I moved to East Africa, working with small-scale farmers, more on the NGO sector side. And so that wasn't really job creation, but really looking at how do we take existing livelihoods. And we know that in many sub-Saharan African countries, actually 80% of the rural population or the population in general is actually engaged in farming. So that's probably the kind of development livelihood that I understand best. And then I, like Goldilocks, I sort of switched to the private sector and the for-profit side of things when I co-founded and became chief operating officer of a Pan-African FinTech company, which is now called AZA Finance. It was called BitPesa back in the day. And just thinking about the importance of payments, which actually cuts across all industries. So whether that's the informal sector and micro entrepreneurs using M-Pesa to make mobile payments for paying suppliers, but also receiving payments from customers. I think that helped me see kind of more the informal sector. And then we also worked with SMEs and growing businesses and even up to multinationals who are essentially trying to do business and make payments. So I feel like I've been privileged to see a lot of different sectors, from small-scale farmers, in informal sector across Africa, SMEs and small growing businesses, all the way up to corporates and multinationals across the continent.
That's amazing. But then I guess the question would be then pivoting into the portfolio that you're managing now, and that is very specific in creating opportunities for young people in Africa. What was the thinking behind that journey, and how, maybe just a broad overview of how your portfolio operates?
Sure. So I was fortunate to inherit a portfolio from my predecessor that fell into, I would say broadly, two main sectors, although we have a third one that isn't really about income generation, but more wealth accumulation. So on the income generation side, our portfolio falls mostly into the agriculture space. So everything from subsistence farming, so some of more of the crops like maize, for example, that are grown and are feeding Africa, up to fruits and vegetables and more up to more cash crops. As well as agribusinesses and agri-SMEs. So that could involve aggregating, that could involve processing, and in some cases actually export food products within the broader continent of Africa and even outside. And then our second large pillar is around technology, which is super broad, but it started with really looking at how Africa's young population can leverage digital skills and tech skills into tech jobs, both on the continent, but really even off the continent. So looking at BPO or outsourcing more broadly.
What's BPO?
Oh, sorry, business processing outsourcing.
Yeah. Just in case.
Yes, it's good for for folks. We use too many acronyms in the development sector, and we've sort of what I call backwards integrated into tech skills that are taught more in secondary school or even at the elementary school level, because we recognize that you have to start that digital literacy and digital skills training earlier in life. Like I feel very privileged. My father exposed me to personal computers very early on, and then that led to me, majoring in computer science or taking my first C++ class in high school, and then developing or getting a computer science degree in undergrad. So I think we recognize that there is an importance to early exposure to digital literacy that then hopefully will lead to wider employment and even better if it's tech employment, which we believe is kind of the future of work.
I think so. It's interesting the way you've laid out how you're thinking about like funding priorities within the work that in the work that you're doing. But I guess one question here is, what would you say is the overall role of philanthropy or this sorts of social impact investments within this job creation, employment, wealth accumulation space? Like, what is the role? I know a lot of times we talk about like catalytic funding. Essentially, you're funding opportunities that might otherwise not get the financial backing to either grow or scale or start or test or experiment. But how would you articulate the role that the funding that you disperse, what role does that play in the employment space?
Yes, I mean, like many things in development, it's probably a matrix at best.
Yeah.
At worst, it's sort of this mix of arrows pointing everywhere. And I think that's actually one of the challenging things about philanthropy sometimes is you're seeing a lot of opportunities to catalyze work that's already happening. But there can be a mismatch between the opportunities in the sector, in the space, and the instruments or the theories of change that funders, whether that's through grants or equity or debt, and depending on the business model. So I think we could talk for hours actually, depending. So I think the first thing to clarify is it really does depend on both the part of the livelihood sector you're trying to influence, and then for a funder, what their mandate and what their objective is. So I'd say we're talking about rural livelihoods, and I gave the example of we focus a lot on smallholder agriculture. Generally, that matches with philanthropic funding because it's saying we need to essentially create more opportunities for income generation and wealth creation in a sector that is traditionally, as I said before, subsistence. And so a lot of what is being grown across Africa is first and foremost for household consumption. And then it's sort of bonus points if the excess can be sold locally. And then when we're talking about export, for example, that really needs processing or value addition on the continent. So that's kind of specific to the agriculture space. Moving into more peri-urban or urban livelihoods, that's where you can get some opportunities for business models that might involve some earned revenue. So perhaps, so let's use like digital skills training or wider, just like TVETs or vocational training. There may be some component of the person who is being trained has some ability to pay a fee for the training that they're receiving. But generally what I've seen, this is quite a wide generalization, upskilling programs cost more than like the ability to pay, right? So there needs to be some sort of subsidy model either by the local government or by philanthropy or potentially an impact investor. And then I think there's just straight commercial job creation and employment, which is, hey, I'm private sector. This is my industry. I am creating a business or scaling a business, and I am employing more youth. And quite frankly, like addressing youth employment is just part of that. But I think the role of philanthropy is really in the first 2/3 of that spectrum is where we're really talking about more development, areas, things that would be difficult to expect some sort of earned revenue, and then sort of the mid-range where there's opportunity for earned revenue.
But I really like the way you've broken it down. So thinking about like different types of investments, or if you call them investments, so there's or philanthropic investment, if you call it that, and there's also like the equity and like knowing what type of funding solution is useful for what intervention and how that can be useful across the, I guess, value chain as well as the different like end-to-end pipelines. But then also you've kind of broken it down by like, okay, so in the rural areas, you're thinking about, how can you give access to markets, value-added opportunities to those sorts of like raw agricultural goods. In the peri-urban and urban areas, you're thinking about how can you get, I guess, subsidize the skills or opportunities for internships or placements and like work experience and really enabling that piece. And then also, obviously, you're talking about private sector as well, so developing, which isn't necessarily where philanthropy plays in that sense. Yeah. So it's really interesting how you've broken it down. But I think one of the things I wanted to kind of touch on is this question of, not a question, but the issue of demand-led and demand-driven employment solutions, because that's where it feels like the answers kind of lies, if we can call it an answer, right? So how do you make sure that your funding and grant making is aligned with that demand, or at least where the demand is now and where it might be going in the future? You've mentioned the work that Generation does and how you're supporting that work as well. But how do you think about prioritizing your portfolio when you're thinking about, okay, which opportunities or which interventions or which initiatives should I be supporting?
I think this is one of the most challenging roles of philanthropy at a broader level, but also for individual foundations, because we're even one step removed from the action, right? We're generally not, in the sectors that our partners are involved in. So I think there's a lot of learning to be done from our partners and understanding like what is happening in your sector. And also I think it's important to highlight each African country. Africa is not one country. So, understanding at a country by country basis, but even at the county level or the district level or the province, like what's happening there. So there's a lot of zooming in that has to happen. I think of it actually more from a timeline perspective. So as a foundation, I think it's important to think about what is the impact that we can help drive and catalyze that is here and now, right? So it's in this short-term program, and I define short-term as, say, 3 to 6 months, how can we get youth into jobs this year, right? So that's, for me, that's very short-term. Then I'm looking to also build out the portfolio with mid-term job creation. So, okay, maybe this is going to be a skill set that's built up over a longer period of time. I can bring in the education piece. So maybe these are, they're not a partner of ours, but I visited Fundi Bots in Uganda, and they're actually teaching robotic skills in the youth level. And some of these are out of school dropouts. So they're learning these robotic skills and practical skills that they can use in engineering in local jobs. But it will maybe take years to develop that kind of skill set and then, get enough experience to then be employed either informally or formally in that skill set. And then we're also, as a foundation, looking at longer term value chains. And so one example is we partner with Gatsby Africa on one of their pillars, which is commercial forestry. So we're talking really long term. There's a long, not super long term, but we're talking about going from a eucalyptus plantation to factories that are doing primary processing and creating saw logs, and then engineered timber production, which is secondary processing, and then offtake, which is furniture makers, more SMEs, or even being built into wood-based construction. So I guess the best way to describe it is we don't want to wait so long and only focus on long-term job creation, but we need to be looking at things that are more immediate and medium term. And it's hard to align and kind of read the tea leaves, especially when our macro environment is quite volatile, right? Case in point, most of us thought AI was sci-fi until a couple years ago, and now it's hard to find someone who hasn't either consciously or subconsciously engaged with AI. And so that's really changing. That's a trend that is shaping the way that everybody's thinking about, how do I do work as an individual? How is my company supposed to adapt? And then how are our sectors going to evolve? How are our economies going to evolve to keep up with trends like AI? And then working backwards to figure out, okay, how's this going to affect the informal sector and the formal sector? So I guess it's hard to anticipate some of these things.
There's this point when we're just chatting earlier about, I guess, the informal versus formal, and you've just kind of touched on that now. And I think when we talk about measures of unemployment, or also when you're trying to calibrate what is successful, right? You're looking at formal jobs and formal opportunities that are essentially in the data and filled in by, either the Bureau of Statistics can essentially look into these specific types of jobs or specific job opportunities. But what are your thoughts around empowering the informal sector? Because there's so many, the majority of African youth and also Africans at large are actually involved in the informal sector, are participating or are generating their income from the informal sector. How do you think philanthropic funding can help to either, I don't know, would the solution be to formalize, or how do you then just empower that sector to create more opportunities and create more sustainable opportunities for income generation?
It's a great question. And with the caveat that the informal sector and sort of how to catalyze that hasn't been a key part of our strategy, but I'm really interested in it because we were just talking about how the statistics, and it's sliced different ways depending on which agency, are different. But, the ones I pulled up were saying, oh, well, youth employment or unemployment is only 11%. But, it's like, what is that factoring in, and is that just formal jobs or whatnot? But I mean, it's hard to get. My second home is Nairobi. And, everywhere you look, there's informal sector around you and often driven by the youth. So it's not something we focused on. I think there's interesting work to be done to essentially improve this. I think the question I have, and it depends on the foundation, is like, are you trying to drive individual livelihoods, or are you trying to improve an overall sector? So I think there's a lot of great work that other foundations do that are essentially saying, hey, here's a youth entrepreneur, and how do we give them either or support them with the skills or access to finance or maybe market linkages, connections to buyers, so that youth entrepreneur can thrive. And then I think there's a multiplier effect if you say, okay, we're going to reach thousands of these young informal entrepreneurs. So I think you could take it from a breadth approach, and then really support that young entrepreneur to excel in their business. I think there are other funders who are looking at, well, does that really, so that might scale in terms of number of youth reached, but does that actually create businesses that are then going to employ, exponential numbers? So I think there's a trade-off that I want to acknowledge, and I think that's mainly one of the reasons why we haven't chosen to focus on boosting the informal sector, because there's another thing, which is probably another podcast topic, which is the role of SMEs and formal businesses to contribute to the tax base and tax revenue. So I think one thing that's important to acknowledge is that when an informal sector thrives and it isn't taxed, then it may help at the individual level to improve livelihoods, but may not uplift the entire economy.
Yeah.
I think we need both, to be clear, because we shouldn't force youth to do formal jobs if they don't want them, and if it's not appropriate, and if there aren't enough businesses to absorb them.
Yeah.
So I think it's not a either or, it's a both and.
Yeah.
And foundations need to figure out if they want to, which part of the sector they want to help catalyze.
One follow-up question on this in terms of whether or not how foundations decide how they want to operate. You mentioned like either is it an individual sort of measure, like you're boosting economic opportunity for individuals, and the number of individuals is kind of like the number that you're measuring as your impact or your success, and then also like sector development. Is it that you're trying to develop a sector, or you're trying to support maybe broader formal economic growth metrics like GDP and so on and so forth? But then I'm also thinking about a question that I've had also like in my own previous role as a grant maker. And the question for me is that it sometimes feels like philanthropic funding can only do so much, right? So there's a finite amount of resources that you as a grant maker have access to. And you're also like, you already mentioned how you're trying to prioritize. So you're prioritizing according to short, medium, and long term. What are the solutions that are, I guess, so thinking about solutions as well in that sort of short, medium to long, and thinking about end to end, really thinking about how do you move from, like you mentioned, this agriculture value chain of, eucalyptus plantation, and then you're moving into furniture and so on and so forth. But how do you think about convening for other, I think for me, the question would be convening other philanthropies or philanthropists or fund operators or grant makers to think about how to bring funding together in a way that if you're saying, okay, this is the sector that we're trying to energize, this is what we're kind of saying, this is what we're doubling down on for the next maybe 2 or 3 years. Because I feel like that's the only way to really scale the work that you're supporting.
Yes.
Otherwise, I kind of see it as different foundations of philanthropies doing work in different silos, and kind of I'm doing my work over here and you're doing your work over there. How do you in your own portfolio kind of think about approaching multiplier effects to your funding, or are you thinking about that at all?
100%.
Yeah.
I mean, I feel very privileged that I have a role where I can steward our foundation's resources towards mostly nonprofits across sub-Saharan Africa, that we do a bit of impact investing as well. But I see my role is to also come alongside other livelihood-focused foundations and funders, so that collectively we can create even more of an impact. So, of course, you don't want to engage in groupthink. That's always a danger of like-minded and well-intentioned funders getting together. Is that, if you have a blind spot as a group, then you may miss
out something.
Catalyzing a part of the ecosystem that really should be funded but is underfunded. I feel very privileged to work with other foundations, some of whom have other sectors, right, health and education, but where we align and kind of meet on a regular basis is to discuss, who's in our pipeline, can we share due diligence, and then how can we work together to partner effectively with the organizations that we both fund. So that's kind of at the tactical level of how I personally work with other foundations. Now, the more interesting question is not the how we work together, but is like, what do we work on? So, I hesitate to bring this up because it's not super public, but I think be able to start shedding light and bringing attention to it. A number of organizations of both operators, doers on the continent, and funders are starting to create a livelihood impact alliance. And it's meant to actually shine a light on a very complex sector across Africa to improve incomes. And so I know this is kind of more broad than kind of employment. But we are trying to, as well, this is one of the debates, is like, what is the North Star metric or set of North Star metrics? I guess North Star implies you have one. But, let's say hypothetically it was increase in income. What is good enough, right? And what are the parts of the sector that increase income the most for the most people? So there's a breadth component. So how many people's incomes can we increase? A depth. So how transformative is the increase in impact? For example, Livelihood Impact Fund talks about 5x return on investment within 5 years. So for example, if it costs $1,000 to train a youth in a particular skill, can that organization enable that youth to earn 5 times that within 5 years? Not every foundation uses that same kind of SROI metric or ROI metric, but it could be about aligning. So I think that's one of the ways, and I think it is important for funders who may, even if they have different theories of change or use different metrics, I think if we can sort of work with academics, researchers, there is a pool and library of RCTs. But to your point, it's generally like, oh, this org claims this RCT, right? And this org claims this one. But where's the pooled library of resources where we can look across, do comparative studies and look at all the RCTs, and then you can start pooling. It's like, go back to what I said, that messy matrix of, okay, well, our foundation is trying to serve this country and this kind of part of the sector, whether it's informal or formal. And actually, we're really passionate about, the gender lens and improving incomes for women. And so actually, these are the kinds of skills that really well suit women-led businesses. Whatever it is, I think just kind of more coordination. So I think I love C's. I love alliteration. So it's like there's a convening component, there's a coordination component, and then most importantly, there's a collaboration, whether that results in, at the funder level, more funding, attracting more capital to be funding more data-driven, evidence-backed organizations that are driving income, livelihood generation across the sector. And then there's even an advocacy component too, which we haven't spoken a lot about, mainly because that's not our focus, but it's like, how can we partner with African governments to create the kinds of policies that support income generation for youth in their country?
There's a lot packed in there, Charlene.
I like to just pack it in.
First of all, I actually just love the 3 C's as well. I'm very big, and there's 3 of them, so I love 3-part things as well. So there's a few different things. I think one thing I would say though, and the last point you made about like the convening and cooperation and collaboration, is something that has been on my mind a lot, right? So there's 2 types of intersections I see within this, the unemployment puzzle, if you, or matrix as you call it. The first one is like the intersections between the different, I call them ecosystem players. So like you mentioned, there's researchers who are doing research on this as we speak, who have published papers on, this is the way you should write your CV, or this is the soft skill you need to add on to this training, or this is the way you need to, the quality of trainers that you need to have on your program that will give you the most, the best outcomes or the highest outcomes. Again, I was having a conversation with a researcher who was saying that only kind of clears it might only be relevant in that space and time, in that place, for some certain reasons you can't control. By design. Exactly. But at the same time, how are we thinking about bringing all these different learnings into one space with the people who are funding the programs, with the people who are implementing and designing the programs, with the youth and people who are actually receiving the programs as well? How are we supposed to convene that sort of all the different intersections? I think that's on one hand. And the second thing that you also talked about is like the different, because would I call them sectors? Because in some sense, people think someone might think about youth employment as a digital skills question because that's what they're focused on. Some would think about it as an agribusiness or agriculture question because that's what they're focused on. But there are cross sections across or intersections across all these different topic areas, and everyone is kind of working on their thing on their own. So it's how do you sort of bring that together is the question I guess every day we're thinking about how to solve. Yeah.
I know. I was like, I think that's the £1,000,000 question. I say pound because we're sitting here in the UK, although I'm American. I think that's the challenge. And I think that is the purpose of why we're trying to build alliances and, livelihood impact alliance is one. Perhaps there are others that I humbly may not be aware of, but I think that's meant to be that place where you can coordinate. I think it would be naive to expect that every funder is going to want to cover all bases, right?
Of course.
We have to, I think you can't have a conversation about youth employment in Africa without acknowledging MasterCard Foundation's grand vision, right? 30 million jobs by 2030, right? I think the complexity is that no matter how many jobs you're trying to reach or livelihoods you're trying to improve, we need to cover all bases. And I think it would be naive to think that every funder is going to cover all bases. So the complexity is kind of like a bingo card. Is like, how can we cover all our bases, but yet not be spread too thinly? And so I think just like all complex approaches to development, there's no panacea. There's no silver bullet. Much to, I think when I first started in development, over 15 years ago, like I think the naive MBA student I was, they thought, oh, surely there's just, microfinance. Let's press this button and then we'll just figure it out. And we just have to find the button and then press it. It's so much more complex than that. And so I think what would really help our sector and our ecosystem is to do a kind of like stack rank. And that's even hard in itself, but it's like, let's narrow down the scope. So it's like, there need to be different work streams. So to the earlier point, which I didn't address, very knowledgeably because it's not our focus. If there's a lot to be done around informal sector and gig economy, it's gig work, then let's have a work stream of doers doing that great, funders who are prepared to fund that short-term, medium-term, long-term, and then kind of doing that segment by segment. But I think you really can't boil the ocean when it comes to development. So I think there need to be individual, not that many, but sort of like coordinated efforts. I love the Rule of Threes, which I've already used today. But even if there were just 3 work streams, 3 sectors where you get the right group of government, I didn't mention multilaterals, bilaterals, not sure exactly how they'd fit in at this point, private sector, academics and researchers, the funders with the right instruments, and most importantly, the amazing entrepreneurs and organizations that are driving change. But yeah, it's complicated.
It is. And I think that's the purpose of having these conversations, right? So how can we drive towards that as the overarching goal is that, okay, we want to see, I think even thinking about it in terms of, is it income generation? Is it placement into a job? Is it you started a business that is then employing, or you've increased revenue? So even when I started the concept of this podcast, I then started to realize that, okay, there's quite a few different, what is the end goal here? Is it employment for employment's sake? Is it for improved livelihoods? And then if it's that, maybe it's not necessarily a job as in take you're in a job, but then what is your livelihood better? Is your standard of living improved? So there's so many other, I guess, layers and questions to this. And this is essentially what it is that you're working on. One other thing I wanted to talk about, because we've talked about this a lot, is digital skills and the digital economy. Everyone knows the digital economy is growing. I don't think that really is debatable at this point. Also with AI, like you mentioned, becoming one of the central points of any conversation really at this point, it also feels like some jobs are going to be lost as well. And there's different projections for how many and by when the job replacements will happen, or I mean, how long that process will take. But it also feels like there have been quite a few digital skills training programs on the continent. I've seen a few, supported a few as well. Sometimes there's that gap between the expected outcomes and what actually sort of happened. So if you say you trained 30,000 people, for example, and maybe 1,000 got into full-time job opportunities, that doesn't really feel like the right ratio that you would want, especially when you consider, as you mentioned, the scale of the need, right? So you're thinking about what's replicable at scale. What are the issues that we need to be solved? Because there's so many young people who need those trainings, one, and also who need the employment opportunities. I know you've also done some work supporting digital skills training programs, and you've had some learnings from that. What is your perspective on the, I guess, skills training? I have some views, but I want to hear more from
I'm curious
you.
what you would say, Tammy.
What is your perspective on the digital skills training interventions, and how can those sorts of programs be made more effective? And I think part of it is this question, you've kind of already answered it from at the beginning about the demand, right?
Yeah, demand
So
side.
the demand is the question here. Do we really understand the demand? Do we really understand what employers want? Which I feel like sometimes some organizations are out of touch with. So they're kind of doing a training, but not really clear on what the employers really want. And are they training for that? But are there any other thoughts that you have on this specific topic about training and equipping young Africans for the digital economy or the future of work?
Sure. Again, with the caveat that I cover, many sectors, so I wouldn't claim to be an expert on digital economy and digital jobs, despite being a computer science major, maybe because I haven't touched a line of code in 20 years, maybe 25. I think, let me segment. So I think there's kind of informal digital skills training and livelihood, so kind of like what I would call freelancing, and then there's the digital skills for formal employment. So I think they kind of have to be treated separately. I think there's a lot of hope that people have had in our sector around freelancing and gig work, and I do think there is a lot of opportunity. I think it's important. So I think that has higher potential for scale. But I think the demand side is a little bit less certain for it. Because essentially, when you're being trained to be a freelancer, then you're going to look at what platforms like Upwork or Fiverr. So I think unless the training program really differentiates your skills, so for example, if I may say Generations, kind of honing in really on digital marketing. Right, something that's more differentiated than, say, something like transcription, which might be more commoditized. I think it's hard to compete as a freelancer on a big, wide platform where there are thousands and thousands and thousands of other gig workers who have already built up a track record of credibility and reviews and things like that. So I think gig work's really hard. I think I would really struggle. I think that can be cracked and could be scaled with the right choice of skills. And then I have less to say about digital skills training, I think, for the formal sector, mainly because I think we're still seeing how things shake out with AI. So kind of generally what I've been hearing and discussing with other peers is that probably lower level digital skills. So for example, like the basic programming, maybe that will get quote unquote eaten up by AI. But actually, there's still a lot of work to be done or to improve current AI models. But there's still a role for I'll give another like quote unquote like less skilled is like, so for example, prompt engineering, like in Gen AI. So eventually we'll have more agents. And so it's like, do you need a human in the loop for that level? But of course, like there's a role for humans in the loop at higher levels and for project management. And like someone's got to manage these AI agents, for example. So I still think there's potential. I think it's still early days to see how that's going to impact. And then talking to other employers about the future of work, I think this data analysis, which is, of course, still being put through AI, but yeah, just a thoughtful kind of maybe like holistic, not just the hardcore like Power BI cranking of data, but just like actually a human analysis of what that data is saying, right? So I think differentiating between the skills that like can be automated, whether by a non-AI system or an AI system, versus things that require interpretation and analysis, and most importantly, the application, right? Not application to a general LLM, but it's like specific to our company. What does this data mean for us? So, sorry, this is not super like concise, but I just think we're still figuring out what that will be from digital skills in the formal sector. But yeah, I think those are some of the areas I think are still interesting where hopefully youth will still play an important role.
I'm smiling because you start off saying, I'm not really an expert, and then you kind of go into depth about different types. So I was like, I love it. So I think one thing I really appreciate about your work is like you're really thoughtful about how you're building out the portfolio, really thoughtful about engaging with also like all the no. It's just it is what it is, and it's what you're sharing now. And I just wanted to touch on this freelancing piece you mentioned. I spoke to someone as well. He runs like an data science training program. Actually, he's one of the guests on the series as well. And he's mentioned, you mentioned how it's difficult for one young person to kind of stand out in a platform that already has, certified 5-star freelancers who are already establishing their reputation on the platform. And he's like, well, there could be opportunities to kind of then that person being like a sort of like sub Fiverr or sub Upworker themselves. So then kind of having an army of freelancers who then sort of, because you probably can't take on all the opportunities that you would get.
That's correct.
But it's an interesting model that I feel like, having that maybe one central person who is accredited, and then having like maybe building out teams of freelancers in that way. But that's something that just sort of came up in conversation.
Yes, and Generation has been experimenting with that model of a super agent who then apprentices a number of Generation graduates who then kind of get mentored and trained and are doing some of the work under that super agent's profile until they're able to kind of like go build enough experience and reputation to do their own. But there's one piece that we haven't spoken about that is a constraint that I don't think we've cracked yet as a collective sector, which is the device accessibility. So I think it is important to recognize that even if we were to train collectively thousands and thousands of youth, if there is no access to a laptop or low-cost data and bandwidth, then even if you're trained in that skill, you may not be able to actually do the job that you're trained in without that. So there's some of that work to be addressed.
I think you've also just articulated it well, like so super agents and apprentices, right? So that's interesting, something that has probably already existed. So I remember, I think of like the Igbo apprenticeship model in Nigeria, and that already exists, but then kind of transposing that into the digital space and digital world and learning from things that are already working and have worked from the beginning of time, traditionally and culturally as well.
I love that.
Anyway, but I think one final question would be, what are any sort of emerging trends or innovations within the employment space that you're really optimistic about or that excite you? Are there any sorts of initiatives or programs that have come on your table or on your laptop, in your email inbox that you would like to share?
Sure. So I think if you look at broad employment, I kind of categorize, and not that we should like say this either or, but it's just sometimes easier to talk about. I think it really does bridge like the timeline, the continuum, which is, I like to look at things of like, what are existing livelihoods and income generating opportunities that have already existed, to your point, like Africans have been farming for generations, so it's like this is not new. But what opportunities are there to bring more value addition? So one example is I just visited True Farms. Their retail brand is True Moringa, so they have multiple names in Ghana. And it was a great example. We haven't spoken actually about the impact of climate change on, well, everything in our world, but including the economies across Africa. But, they're creating these climate resilience zones where farmers are growing moringa. And this moringa is then, the leaves are being harvested, processed, and then kind of either bought by bulk buyers of moringa powder, which is then ending up in products like at, say, Whole Foods, and then their own retail brand of tea infusions and cosmetics. So that's like a specific example that, like, I'm excited about this trend of how do we link farming that is already happening or could happen across Africa, and then actually supplying the global north. It's one of the things that is really challenging about working across the continent is the lack of Forex coming in. So it's like we've seen weakened currencies across the sector, which is another thing that just compounds the impact of unemployment or lack of livelihoods. That's, again, another whole separate podcast. But yeah, so I'm really excited about trends where there are social enterprises that are able to create market linkages to global buyers. So I wouldn't say that's necessarily a trend. That's been happening already, but I'm continue to be excited about that. On the future side, I'm curious about green jobs and this need for, everything to be more green because we're quickly deteriorating our society. So, I think there's a lot of opportunity for how to generate income from a minimum climate adaptation and then hopefully mitigation. But I'm curious about solar panels are proliferating across the continent. But, one of the things we're facing here in the UK is we have solar, but a shortage of workers to actually maintain these solar panels. And I think the same thing could happen across the continent as we're getting to more renewable energies. It's like, is there an opportunity for youth to be, this next generation servicing the plethora of either solar or other renewable energy products across the continent? Shortlist Futures, based out of Nairobi, has done a report on like the kind of the future of green jobs, and so I think there's more to dig into there. So yeah, I think it's early days, but if we as a sector can anticipate where those jobs, whether it's green jobs or AI, if we can kind of think ahead, because I think that's one real challenge with that supply-demand mismatch is that by the time you figure out what an economy needs in terms of skills and jobs, either informally or formally, there's a bullwhip effect. It will take time to develop programs, whether it's a, informal training program or a diploma, much less a degree. And we haven't spoken about the role of tertiary education or formal training programs. But it's going to take us time to catch up. So I guess a key takeaway for me is like, how can we think on our feet? How can we, across the sector, really get real-time data and experience from the ground and then fund entrepreneurs who are able to react quickly and effectively to address those opportunities? And then how do we have government policy and regulatory frameworks that at minimum enable and at best incentivize those opportunities to be served?
I was going to ask you for final thoughts, but I feel like that wrapped it up almost perfectly. how do we stay ahead of the curve, or at least stay with the curve as it moves and as it evolves? And I think that's the challenge to everyone who is working towards the impact, a sustainable impact, livelihoods, job creation, and trying to solve for employment of the continent. Thank you so much, Charlene. I think we can wrap it up here.
You're so welcome, Ted.
I
Thank you so
appreciate
much.
you coming and sharing your wisdom and insights. And yeah, to everyone who joined us and watched, thank you for watching, and see you on the next episode.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.